Autsin Harney. I'm Secretary of the Labour Party Autism Neurodiversity Steering Group, but I'm also on the National Executive Committee for the PCS Union as well. I'll just begin just to give a brief background about myself. I mean, I was diagnosed with quasi-autism at the age of 4, told by the top doctors in the world I wasn't fit for mainstream society. I'll keep that brief, I won't go into much detail, and I consider that time is a very important factor at this meeting. But I think what we need to be also clear about, I don't know how many people have even heard the term quasi-autism, because you see, Asperger's syndrome didn't exist in those days when I was diagnosed. I'm talking the early 70s, so I didn't want to give away my age this evening. But it wasn't actually recognised until 1994. What happened was Leo Kanner discovered autism in America, but actually Hans Asperger, he put forward a paper the following year, 1944, for about mild forms of autism, but it was rejected, put on the shelf, and we had to wait 50 years until this condition was recognised. It certainly did deal with the very difficult prejudice barriers we were up against, but it was only just a mere assault on the situation, I'm afraid, because we didn't really make a great deal of progress, and it's been very, very slow on how we help autistic people out in society, autistic adults and autistic children. Now, just to tell you about, I worked for the civil service back in 1991. It was the following year, they didn't have what's called the Disability Discrimination Act, 1992. I was sacked because there was no reasonable adjustments in those days, they didn't exist. So there was no reasonable adjustments to accommodate my neurological condition, or as people said in those days, learning disability. But I'm glad to stand shoulder to shoulder with Janine, who's going to speak later, to say that it's not a learning disability. And I think that's something we need to educate society on, because in actual fact, autistic people do have talents and they do have potential, and I think it's important that we support them in our society and how we go forward. Now, what it was, I didn't get any support even from welfare, but I got support from the trade union, believe it or not. They actually got me back into the civil service, only they stuck their necks out, and I have to say the most socialist reps of all, some of who very good comrades of Mark Sawaka from years back, who's now our General Secretary, really did stick their necks out for me. And I am paying back this gratitude to PCS Union. So I've been working very hard, doing personal cases up to Employment Tribunal, and even got as far as the National Executive Committee, being continued to see a delegate, spoke at conference. I even stood as Labour Councillor back in 2005, but I've been more swamped with trade union duties, and I didn't do too badly, 1,500 votes ago in a Tory ward. But yeah, I think the grim reality is that discrimination still continues against autistic neurodivergent people. I mean, despite the fact that we had a landmark case, Hewitt versus Motorola in 2004, which declared dismissal of an autistic employee as unlawful, today only 16% of autistic people have full-time employment, and a further 9% are in part-time employment due to the institutionalised prejudice of employers. The terrible reality also is that many employers have got prejudices against reasonable adjustments. They think it's a burden in terms of costs, investment, and we even have Tory councillors thinking they're a burden on the taxpayer. And how we have to reform and change and radicalise society, I think we've got a long way to go. But I'm proud to be part of a political party called Labour that is the first party to endorse autism neurodiversity in its manifesto. And I think it's about building on that. Under this terrible Tory government, benefits actions, and of course you'll read more detail in our Autism Neurodiversity Manifesto. We've had copies of given them out on the table, we certainly have them on our website. Cuts to social care and housing have driven autistic people to suicide, autistic school leavers in their transition to adulthood, talk of falling off a cliff as support services come to an end. Bullying and hate crime increase with the demonisation of disabled claimants by the media. And I make these points clear as a PCS member, a National Executive Committee. Our largest government department is the Department of Works and Pensions. And I'm sure when Mark, our General Secretary, speaks, he'll give you some more detail about the brutal realities against disabled people that are occurring, including autistic people. There's one other thing I wanted to make quite clear, and someone else, I think it's Emma's going to speak in more detail on this, but profiteers and quacks exploit the fear of autistic people by marketing false and dangerous treatment for cures. What a disgrace. And how is that an example to employers, when especially we've got so many of the world's top politicians involved in this idea of cure for autism? An absolute disgrace, because no such cure exists. Why not say we have a cure for people of different sexual orientation? And we think that's a disgraceful prejudice, and the same applies for anybody who's autistic or neurodivergent. It's vital to develop the Autism Act that includes obligation on employers. There needs to be education and training about autism and neurodiversity at all levels for political decision makers, employers, administrators of justice, education, staff, public service providers, parents, and so on. I'm talking about reasonable adjustments, and I'd like to commend, of course, Janine, who did a very good generic reasonable adjustment plan, the TUC Guide to Autism, back in 2014, and I think that's a very good generic reasonable adjustment plan to follow. Although each autistic person is an individual, we have to bear that in mind, and we have to understand what their personal individual needs are when they're interviewed. We also have to look about interviews, how we structure interviews, how we make interviews more autistic friendly. And quite frankly, I'm disgusted with what's going on. They're still using some of the old-fashioned type interviews in the civil service. Our employer, even going back to the days of paperboard, but sort of like a board meeting, which can actually put autistic people under a lot of pressure, and neurodivergent people too. Also, the fact is, another issue I really wanted to raise, and of course you can read about the generic reasonable adjustment plan, it's on the website. Because time was a factor, I didn't want to go into too much detail about that. But there was one thing I did want to add. It's not just reasonable adjustments under the Equality Act. The employer owes you a duty of care under health and safety. Now tomorrow I'm going to the National Hazards Campaign Committee meeting in Manchester. I'm on the National Health and Safety Committee for PCS. And I think the reality is we have to understand that if an employer owes you a duty of care, that means they have to give you a reasonable adjustment regardless. Because, taking an employer on in terms of a grievance, you've only got 3 months before you go to an employment tribunal. In terms of personal injury claim, you've got 5 years. So I think that's an important issue to add in terms of reasonable adjustments, how we can improve the working lives of autistic people. The other point is understand that they need to be included. We have to understand what their issues are, what their problems are. We have to be more educated on this, because sadly that isn't the case. And it was very brutal in my day and age as a child. People had never even heard what autism was. People just thought you were brain damaged, or they used all the other derogatory terms as well, which was quite brutal then. I've covered quite a lot of ground, and I have to allow for other speakers, and I think that's important. I just wanted to conclude. It was actually, I have to thank trade unionism and socialism for where I am now in PCS, and I'm proud to be a member of the Labour Party as well, probably the only socialist party that exists, and thanks to Jeremy Corbyn, who's resurrected, and John McDonnell. I'm sorry I didn't want to leave you out, John. Very important that is. I just wanted to be quite clear. We can proudly say that as we are the only political party to include the needs of the autistic neurodivergent people in our manifesto. It is also true that we should encourage autistic people or neurodivergents to be active in the trade unions in order to represent their diverse workforce. And lastly, if we are serious in tackling the prejudice of our society, we must encourage autistic neurodivergent people to stand as councillors, regional assembly members and members of parliament in our forthcoming elections. I make this point quite clear because the more we have, the more we can change society, the more we can educate. I'll conclude by saying solidarity.